What if everything you are, your health, your mind, your destiny was determined not by your choices, but by the obsession of ancestors you never met? What if your very DNA was shaped, warped, and condemned in the name of power? For centuries, royal families across the world sealed their empires through a chilling pact, sacrificing genetic diversity in favor of dynastic control. Cousins married cousins, uncles wed nieces, siblings became spouses, all in the name of preserving the so-called purity of royal blood. But beneath the gilded thrones and opulent ceremonies, a darker truth was growing. Twisted family trees gave birth to broken bodies, clouded minds, and a legacy of silent suffering. Today, we peel back the royal veil and expose the heartbreaking, unbelievable, and often horrifying stories of history's most inbred women. By the time we reach number one, you'll understand that history's greatest empires weren't just built on war or diplomacy. They were built on blood. And sometimes, that blood came at a terrible cost. Let's begin our descent into this haunting lineage, starting at number 10. Number 10. Joanna of Castile, the queen called mad. Joanna of Castile, born in 1479 to Spain's legendary Catholic monarchs Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, was never meant to rule. But fate had other plans. After the deaths of her older siblings, Joanna was suddenly thrust into the line of succession. Her marriage to Philip the Handsome, heir to the Habsburgs, was supposed to solidify Spanish power across Europe. But instead, it launched one of the darkest genetic legacies in royal history. Joanna was the result of generations of strategic intermarriages, her family line already creaking under the weight of shared blood. The Trastamara dynasty, her Spanish roots, had a long history of cousin marriages. Her husband Philip came from the Habsburgs, a family whose genetic inbreeding would become infamous. Together, they were more than just political partners. They were the genetic crossroads of two dangerously intertwined empires. Joanna's life quickly spiraled after Philip's sudden death in 1506. Joanna's grief consumed her. According to legend, she refused to be separated from his corpse, traveling with his coffin from village to village. But modern historians argue that what was once dismissed as madness may have been more complex. A mental illness deepened, if not caused, by generations of genetic compression. Her eventual confinement in a convent lasted over 4 decades. She died in 1555, a queen in name only, stripped of power, isolated by court politics, and haunted by the ghosts of her lineage. Her son Charles V would go on to rule the Holy Roman Empire, but the genetic shadow of his mother and of his Habsburg blood never left him. Joanna's life was not destroyed by war or betrayal, but by a deeper war within her very biology, a silent collapse written in her chromosomes. Number 9. Charlotte of Belgium, the Forgotten Empress. Charlotte of Belgium, born in 1840, was raised in a court that believed in elegance, diplomacy, and the sacred duty of monarchy. But beneath the silken ceremony, Charlotte was walking into a royal trap, one lined with centuries of genetic missteps. Her father, King Leopold I, had already secured Belgium's place on the European map. But it was her marriage to Archduke Maximilian of Austria, a member of the notorious Habsburg dynasty, that would mark the true beginning of her tragedy. The Habsburgs were legendary for their relentless inbreeding, generations of marriages between cousins, uncles, and nieces designed to protect the family name and empire. By the time Charlotte entered the fold, the damage was already done. Maximilian was idealistic, perhaps naive. In 1864, backed by Napoleon III, he and Charlotte sailed to Mexico to rule as emperor and empress. But the empire was doomed from the start. Resistance in Mexico was fierce. and Maximilian was executed by firing squad just 3 years later. Alone and widowed at 27, Charlotte returned to Europe, but her mind was unraveling. She believed the Pope was trying to poison her. She sent frantic letters to world leaders. She saw conspiracies in every corner. Diagnosed with what was then called madness, Charlotte lived the next 60 years in mental and emotional isolation. But this wasn't just the story of a grieving widow. Like Joanna of Castile before her, Charlotte carried the hidden weight of centuries of inbreeding. Studies of the Habsburg line show staggering levels of genetic similarity. Some members had fewer unique ancestors than an isolated island tribe. Charlotte's fate wasn't just the result of trauma. It was the biological inheritance of a family that had married itself too many times. Number 8. Maria Anna of Spain, born to marry her uncle. If royal bloodlines were rivers, Maria Anna of Spain was born where two heavily polluted streams met. Born in 1606 to King Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria, Maria Anna was the product of Habsburg on Habsburg pairing, part of a family tree that no longer branched. Her parents were first cousins. Her grandparents were cousins. And her destiny? To marry her uncle. That's right. Maria Anna was sent from Madrid to Vienna to become the wife of Ferdinand III, the Holy Roman Emperor, and her biological uncle. The union, though politically strategic, was genetically catastrophic. And it wasn't just Maria Anna, her entire generation was collapsing under the genetic pressure of centuries of intermarriage. By the time she bore children with Ferdinand, the defects began to show. Their son, Leopold I, would go on to rule, but he too would marry within the family, continuing the pattern. Scholars examining the Habsburg dynasty found that this era marked one of the most extreme cases of inbreeding in modern history. The average Habsburg had a higher coefficient of inbreeding than even children of sibling pairs today. Maria Anna's life may seem distant, an empress of the 17th century, but her story is frighteningly modern because it proves that unchecked obsession with purity, whether racial, political, or biological, always ends the same way, in suffering. Number 7. Maria I, Portugal, the queen who lost her mind. Known in her youth as Maria the Pious, she would later become infamous as Maria the Mad. Born in 1734, Maria I of Portugal had every hallmark of a successful monarch: deep faith, strong education, and a deep sense of duty. But her family tree told a different story. Her father, King Joseph I, was married to his niece. Her mother, Mariana Victoria of Spain, was herself the product of royal cousin marriage. When Maria ascended the throne in 1777, she was the first undisputed queen regnant of Portugal. But already, cracks were forming. Under pressure to maintain the bloodline, Maria married her own uncle, Pedro III, another deeply inbred member of the Iberian dynasties. Their union produced children, but many died young, and those who survived bore the marks of inherited frailty. As the years passed, Maria's mental health began to deteriorate. Her episodes became more frequent, more violent. Following the death of her favorite son in 1788, she plunged into a deep psychological collapse. By 1792, she was declared mentally unfit to rule. From then until her death in 1816, she lived in various states of seclusion and sedation, while her son John VI ruled as Prince Regent. Some viewed her condition as divine punishment, others as madness. But modern science offers another theory: the compounded effects of centuries of consanguinity. Marrying too closely, too often, can lead to a host of cognitive and psychiatric issues. In Maria's case, the line between inherited madness and political misfortune is nearly impossible to draw. But her story remains a haunting example of what happens when the walls of the palace are built too close together. Number 6. Princess Alexandra of Bavaria, The Glass Princess. Not all inbred royals were born to rule. Some were born only to suffer. Princess Alexandra of Bavaria, daughter of King Ludwig I of Bavaria, lived in a gilded cage, one she believed was made of glass. Literally, Alexandra was born in 1826 into a noble line that prided itself on ancient blood and old traditions. But those traditions included intermarriage, and by the time she came of age, the psychological effects had begun to emerge. At age 23, Alexandra developed a rare delusion. She believed she had swallowed a glass piano. Terrified she might shatter, she moved delicately, avoided contact, and demanded constant protection. She wore only white. She never married. She lived under a shroud of ritual and rigidity until her death in 1875. While modern psychologists might label her condition as a form of schizophrenia or delusional disorder, her family history cannot be ignored. Like many European royals, the Wittelsbachs family had intermarried for centuries. Her cousin, King Ludwig II, also known as the Mad King of Bavaria, would later be deposed for mental illness. Alexandra's story may sound like fantasy, but it's real, and it speaks to something profoundly tragic, that even in the most luxurious courts, even wrapped in satin and pearls, a mind can break. And sometimes, that break is inherited. Number 5. Elizabeth of Austria, the tragic beauty of a tainted bloodline. To the world, Empress Elizabeth of Austria, or Sisi, was the image of grace. Her slender figure, cascading chestnut hair, and melancholic beauty captured the imagination of an entire empire. But behind the portraits and ballads lay a story shadowed by genetic burdens and emotional torment. Born in 1837 into the Bavarian house of Wittelsbach, yes, the same family as Princess Alexandra of Bavaria, Elizabeth was no stranger to the twisted roots of Europe's royal trees. Her parents were cousins. Her bloodline, like so many others, was a tapestry woven from repetition. At just 15, Sisi married her first cousin, Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria. The match, designed more for politics than compatibility, thrust the naive teenager into one of Europe's most rigid courts. Elizabeth, always a sensitive and anxious soul, struggled under the pressures of court life, and under the gaze of her formidable mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie. Her life became a prison of expectations, endless diets, exhausting beauty regimens, and a mounting sense of isolation. But her sorrow ran deeper than etiquette. The family history she carried, riddled with madness, suicide, and depression, seemed to repeat itself in her own children. Her son, Crown Prince Rudolph, would go on to die in a tragic suicide pact at Mayerling. Sisi herself was haunted by dreams, obsessions, and an ever-growing detachment from reality. While Elizabeth was not considered mad by her contemporaries, her deep emotional distress, her anorexia, and her morbid fixation with death mirror many of the psychological disturbances found in other inbred royals. Her cousin, King Ludwig II of Bavaria, again, from the same family, was famously declared insane. For Sisi, the burden of beauty and blood proved too heavy. She was assassinated in 1898 by an anarchist, stabbed in the heart while walking by Lake Geneva. But perhaps the truest wound was one she carried long before, a genetic inheritance wrapped in lace and sorrow. Number 4. Isabella II of Spain, the misguided monarch. Born in 1830, Queen Isabella II ascended the Spanish throne as a child, at just 3 years old. Her reign would be long, chaotic, and marred by scandal. But behind every political misstep was a biological curse. Isabella was the daughter of Ferdinand VII of Spain and Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, both of whom hailed from deeply inbred Bourbon bloodlines. Her father was also her mother's uncle, The Bourbon family had, for generations, practiced consanguineous marriage as a tool of empire. But by the time Isabella inherited the throne, that tool had turned into a weapon against its own descendants. Isabella was plagued by instability, both political and personal. Forced into a marriage with her double first cousin, Francisco de Aces, her court was rife with rumors about her husband's effeminacy and her own string of lovers. Her sexual affairs, the paternity of her children, and her erratic political choices became tabloid fodder for Europe's gossipy elite. But beneath the drama was a woman trying to hold together a kingdom and a mind, unraveling under pressures both societal and genetic. Her reign ended in exile, deposed by the Glorious Revolution in 1868. She died in Paris decades later, largely forgotten, seen by many historians as a failed monarch. But in truth, Isabella was more than a failed ruler. She was a genetic time bomb, the byproduct of centuries of Bourbon intermarriage, bearing not just the crown of Spain, but the weight of accumulated recessive traits and hereditary instability. She didn't just lose a throne. She was betrayed by the very bloodline that had made her queen. Number 3. Margaret of Austria, the doomed daughter. Born in 1584, Margaret of Austria was the daughter of Charles II of Inner Austria and Maria Anna of Bavaria. She was married off, as most Habsburg women were, to a close relative, Philip III of Spain, her first cousin. And with that, she became Queen of Spain, a nation already steeped in the legacy of incestuous unions. Margaret's own family history reads like a genetic horror story. Her parents were first cousins. Her grandparents were cousins. Her children would go on to marry their cousins. There were no new branches on the family tree, only circles. Margaret's life, like many Habsburg queens, was centered around the expectation of producing heirs. She gave birth to 8 children, but many died in infancy, a common theme in inbred dynasties. The children who survived, like Philip IV, continued the Habsburg habit of marrying within the family. Philip would eventually father Charles II, the infamous Habsburg king who symbolized the genetic decline of an entire empire. But Margaret's own health was fragile, weakened by constant pregnancies and underlying inherited conditions. She died at just 26. Her brief life was defined by duty, obedience, and sacrifice, not just to her husband or country, but to the dangerous tradition of royal inbreeding. In many ways, Margaret was the genetic hinge on which the Habsburg Empire turned and broke. Her death was not a tragedy of war or betrayal. It was a slow collapse of biology, written in her blood long before she ever wore a crown. Number 2. Maria Teresa of Austria, the matriarch of genetic decline. Though revered as one of the most powerful women in European history, Maria Teresa of Austria, who ruled from 1740 to 1780, also stands as a critical figure in the story of royal inbreeding. As the only female ruler of the Habsburg dominions, Maria Teresa was brilliant, determined, and reform-minded. But when it came to marriage and bloodlines, she continued the old ways. She married Francis Stephen of Lorraine, a distant relative, and arranged similar consanguineous marriages for her many children. Her 16 children included Marie Antoinette, the doomed Queen of France, Joseph II, Holy Roman Emperor, and Leopold II. But even as she modernized her empire and administration, she doubled down on the practice of marrying cousins, uncles, and nieces across Europe. The result? A generation riddled with weak health, infertility, and rising psychological issues. Maria Teresa herself suffered from chronic illness and depression. Several of her daughters died young. Her favorite son, Joseph II, was plagued by migraines, emotional outbursts, and possibly bipolar disorder. But perhaps her most significant legacy is that of Charles II of Spain, her distant cousin and fellow Habsburg, often cited as the most genetically damaged king in European history, born generations after the line had crossed the point of no return. Maria Teresa did not suffer madness like some of the others on this list, but her role in preserving and expanding the Habsburg breeding program makes her responsible for generations of suffering. She ruled with steel, but her family fell like glass. From ancient pharaohs to European queens, from Gothic castles to modern documentaries, the pattern repeats. The pursuit of purity breeds fragility. Inbreeding wasn't just a mistake. For centuries, it was policy, a tool of power, control, and continuity. Royal blood was seen as divine, sacred, untouchable. But biology doesn't honor thrones. These women, Isabella II, Marie-Louise, Maria the Pious, Lorraine Whitaker, and Joanna the Med, were not merely victims of bad luck. They were trapped by dynasties that valued legacy more than life. They bore children doomed by biology, suffered mental illnesses misunderstood and unspoken, and were often locked away, silenced, or dismissed. They were vessels for a lineage, and when that lineage faltered, they were discarded like broken icons. And while we can view their stories with horror or pity, there is something deeper, a human warning. Because their tragedies were not purely historical, they echo in today's discussions on genetics, reproductive ethics, and even in remote communities where isolation persists. The same mistakes that unraveled empires still hide in plain sight. What is royalty, after all, if not a fragile illusion sustained by inherited power? And what happens when that inheritance turns on itself? We remember these women not only for the titles they held or the palaces they walked, but for the burden they carried, a burden of blood, tradition, and a fatal misunderstanding of biology. Their lives were not only chapters of history, but cautionary tales etched in chromosomes. History is often shaped by war, diplomacy, and ambition. But in the stories of these women, we find something even more haunting, a legacy shaped not by sword or scepter, but by genes. In the end, the real empire wasn't land or gold. It was the body, and how it bore the weight of a dynasty's darkest decisions.